Those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded votes requested. Recorded vote will be postponed to a later date. I had hoped we would make much more progress and have a vote series before 4:30, but we just spent 2 hours on that amendment. So we probably will have our next vote series after, what? Okay, Mr. McCormick now has the next amendment, log number 3836R3. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for yielding. My amendment expands on the provision. May I make my statement now?
You have an amendment at the desk?
Yes, sir.
Clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The chair recognizes the gentleman for the purpose of explaining his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment expands upon the provision that was included in the final 2024 National Defense Authorization Act to combat the indirect censorship of conservative news outlets in the Department of Defense. Section 1555 of last year's NDAA required that the DoD, when contracting with organizations that place military recruitment advertisements, must include, as a condition of such contact, a certification that the organization does not place advertisements based on political bias or the determination that a media outlet spreads so-called misinformation. This language is necessary because the DoD has contracted with the organizations such as NewsGuard and the Global Disinformation Index. According to the Media Research Center, the average NewsGuard score for the left and lean left outlets was a Green Shield rating of 91 out of 100, while the average rating for right and lean right outlets was low, around 66 of 100. A Global Disinformation Index report on online news lists the 10 riskiest online news outlets as New York Post, The Federalist, The Blaze, The Daily Wire, Newsmax, One American News Network, The American Spectator, The American Conservative, Reason Magazine, and Real Clear Politics, all conservative, while left-leaning sites like ProPublica.com, NPR.org, NewYorkTimes.com, WashingtonPost.com, BuzzFeed News, and Huffington Post were among the 10 lowest risk online news sites, according to their opinion. We should not be excluding large swaths of Americans simply because they watch or read conservative news. My amendment would modify Section 1555 by adding language to clarify the standards on what exactly bias looks like, as well as by striking the one-year sunset included in the subsection C. I'm not an expert on placing advertisements, but I suspect that if we want to ensure the lethality of our armed forces, we should, at the very least, not exclude advertisements in publications where the audience actually knows how to shoot a gun. I ask for my colleagues' support on amendment number 3836. Thank you, sir. With that, I yield back.
Ranking members recognized.
Thank you. The last point the maker of this amendment, or offerer of this amendment, I should say, made, we're not excluding people from advertising. I mean, those decisions will be made, but there's nothing in law that we've put in the law that excludes people from advertising there. This amendment is what excludes us from advertising in certain places, and it excludes any entity that uses basically fact-checking. You may not like that fact-checking, but the basic idea that if you engage, and it mentions some specific organizations, NewsGuard, the Global Disinformation Index, but it then says, or any other entity that engages in well, basically fact-checking, in that type of behavior. I mean, information is out there in wide variety of forms, and one of the things we need to do is analyze it and figure out what's true and what's not. And so now what this amendment does is it excludes the military from advertising with any organization that uses a fact-checking organization. That's just not something that we should be doing. We shouldn't be prohibiting from people from trying to figure out whether or not information that is being provided is accurate. We fought this last year. I hated what we put in the bill last year. We agreed to a compromise, and that's the way it goes. But then to come back and try to double down and expand it, I mean, basically what we're saying is puke out whatever information you want, and nobody should be in a position to question it. I mean, you can question the questioners if you want, and that's fine. But I don't think we should be saying you shouldn't be able to question the information and putting in place a policy that discourages fact-checking. Some information is inaccurate. I think people ought to be able to check and see and figure out for themselves whether or not it is. So really don't like this amendment, don't like what was put in the bill last year, and I would hope that we would not vote in favor of expanding that. And we are reopening something that we took many months to settle last year, and I don't see the necessity of that either. With that, I yield back.
Just 2 quick points on this. I mean, first of all, we've talked all year about the recruiting challenges that we have in our military. And this amendment is going to make recruiting appreciably harder for DoD by restricting all these places where you can have advertisements. Now, if you need fake news to support your belief system, then fine. We live in a free country. One of the principles of a free country is that you should be able to fact-check your news. That is not a crazy idea. That's a very American idea. And I want young men and women to serve in our military who aren't afraid of the facts. I yield back.
Mr. Fallon's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to Dr. McCormick.
Thank you. This amendment only says one thing, that NewsGuard and the Global Disinformation Index are absolutely biased. Their fact checks state that any conservative media outlet shouldn't be advertised on, and it does limit who they can advertise through. To the media sources that you're most likely to recruit people who join the military. So it's bad advertising. I may have my MBA with an emphasis in marketing. I may know a little bit about this. I may even know a little bit about recruiting in the military. Do your homework on that. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to recruit the right people in the military, if you want to have an open discussion, let people advertise without a bias and saying you cannot recruit on conservative outlets. What you said, Mr. Moultrie, was absolutely the opposite of what this is about. This is to allow people to advertise wherever they think is most effective, based on how can I get people in the military, not saying you can't do something because they're not truthful enough. That's the absolute opposite of what this bill was intended to. This was to allow you to advertise where it's most effective to recruit people into the military, and that's all it's about. With that, I yield.
Mr. Garamendi's recognized.
A lot has been said, but not everything. I'd like to yield a minute to our ranking member.
So the plain language of the amendment is not what the gentleman just said. Whatever these NewsGuard or Global Disinformation Index may say, there's nothing in the law that requires the military to listen to them and not advertise where NewsGuard or Global Disinformation says they shouldn't advertise. But what this amendment does is it says, if you use NewsGuard or the Global Disinformation Index or anybody else who provides ratings or opinions on news or information. So if you use any service that provides opinions on news or information, the military will now be blocked from advertising there. That's what the amendment says, okay? I'm reading it right in the computer here. So you're not restricted under current law. You are restricted under this amendment. I don't think we should be restricting in the first place, but we certainly shouldn't be restricting based on whether or not an organization provides ratings or opinions on news or information. Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. I yield back.
With my remaining time, I'd like to yield to
Oh, go ahead.
reclaiming my time.
Okay.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
I would like to yield to Mr. Moulton.
I mean, I'm not quite sure why we're having such a debate over just literally what this amendment says. But it's very clear to me that, as the ranking member just stated, this restricts the DoD's ability to recruit. It's saying that because the New York Times actually checks its facts in ways that the Blaze or whoever else don't, you can't advertise in the New York Times. That is not helpful. That is not helpful for a diverse, qualified force. It's not helpful to our recruiting challenges, and I would add, as I said before, it's un-American.
Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Jimenez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Dr. McCormick.
I want to make this very clear because I wrote the bill and the amendment, I know exactly what it says. It doesn't restrict you from advertising in New York. Any paper whatsoever. What it does is say you can't use these biased news quote unquote fact checkers to determine who you're going to advertise with, because it is absolutely slanted against conservative media. You can advertise anywhere you want to. It doesn't restrict that at all, not one bit. It doesn't say anything in this amendment that I wrote that says you can't advertise where you want to. What it says, you can't use these biased raters that say you shouldn't advertise on conservative media, because that's what it does.
Would the gentleman yield to a question?
Yes.
What happens if you do use those sites?
No, it just says you can't.
Okay, but it says you can't go 100 miles an hour on the freeway, but if no one's there to enforce the law, it doesn't really matter.
So that means that you're not following.
If they use that site, if any organization uses that site, what does the bill say has to happen at that point?
That's like saying the Congress tells you to do something and you don't do it. Well, we've seen that over and over again.
So you're saying there's no enforcement mechanism in this bill? Again, if they use that site, if they do what you said they can't do, it is our interpretation that what last year's law and this year says is you then can't advertise on those sites that you...
No, it doesn't say that.
Okay,
it
so
says you
what
can't
does
use these people to guide you on where you're going to advertise because they're
if
biased.
you do use those, and a number of agencies, well, a number of publications out there will use them. If you do use them...
It's not saying the military can't use these guys to jade where they're going to advertise. That's all it says. It's not saying that you can advertise anywhere you want to. It's just saying don't use these biased people to choose where you're going to advertise. Use it where it's best used. I'm a marketer. There's plenty of marketing places out there that can say where you're going to recruit your military people. Just don't bias yourself against conservative outlets on where you're going to recruit from. That's all I'm saying. Pretty simple.
I still think you're restricting what they can do based on if they do.
Not at all.
But
not at all.
I yield back.
Just get your good advice. That's all.
Mr. DeLuzio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll be brief and echo much of what the ranking member said. My colleague from Georgia, I look at this, it seems to me, if it's not just the few organizations you're worried about, it seems to me any organization that might be ranking or assessing the factual veracity from whatever point of view, right or left, would then disqualify whatever outlet you might be able to advertise there. It seems to do exactly that.
Will the gentleman yield?
Please, go ahead.
So not at all. It's so you don't take advice from the wrong people. You can advertise anywhere you want to. Go to the commercial people that actually make your commercials. Like I said, if you're gonna advertise, you have a business. You want to advertise somewhere. Make sure you go to an advertising agency who knows how you're going to sell the product, to the people who are going to consume it, to the most likely people who are going to come into your organization. If you're going to recruit people, we talked about minorities a second ago. Go into the communities that you need to recruit to get the minorities into your military. This is merely saying don't go to people who are literally biased against conservative outlets and say you shouldn't advertise there because they're conservative. They're not fact-checking. It's just a matter of where you get your advice from.
Respectfully, the way I see you have this drafted, it's anyone that rates or ranks news or information sources for factual accuracy from whatever point of view. I don't think it's drafted to limit it the way you want. I think you could draft it more specifically if you have that goal. I don't think that's what this is. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Any more discussion? Ms. Strickland.
So I too am a marketer with an MBA. So I just have a very basic question. Who is a target audience for this, and what problem are we trying to solve?
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
So the target audience is whatever the military wants to recruit from. And I say anybody, that's fine. What I don't want to have is a market here, in other words, saying going to an obviously biased source that says don't advertise on these people because they're going to limit our ability to actually advertise to people we need to recruit. That's all I'm saying. You don't need to go to biased. Right now there's a NewsGuard Global Disinformation Act that basically saying you should not, because these people are these conservative outlets, which all of them are conservative, that they're biased against, saying you cannot advertise on these people because they're not factual. We're trying to eliminate that bias against advertisement in the most effective markets. That's all.
So the implication is fact-checking equals a bias against conservatives.
Fact-checking with biased fact-checkers, yes.
I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Chair recognizes Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm a lawyer. I'm not a marketer. I don't play one on TV. But I do spend my time trying to implement the laws that Congress passed before I became a member. And reading this, it prohibits the use of any entity that ranks or rakes news information sources for factual accuracy of their content, period. Because you have an or. If they do that, if they rate or rank news or information sources for their factual accuracy, because there's not an and in two, it's an or. You're saying no one that fact checks can be used to contract with the Department of Defense to place ads. That's extraordinarily dangerous right now, because we know that our foreign adversaries are spreading misinformation in the United States. We know that. Everybody on this dais knows that. We know that there are people in the United States spreading misinformation. What you may not know, according to an expert at a conference I attended 5 years ago, we are very concerned that the ability of AI to create misinformation is on track to outpace the ability to detect it. So we might want to get ahead of the fact that there are websites that are spouting misinformation, and we might not want the Department of Defense to advertise on those websites. And this amendment would prohibit the Department of Defense from doing anything to fact-check the sources that they advertise on, whether they're biased or not, whether they currently exist or not. If I tomorrow created a company that solely said 90% of the information on this website is not true, the Department of Defense couldn't contract with me to place advertisements, and that is extraordinarily dangerous. I suggest you have this redrafted if you have a different intent, because the way it is drafted, that's how it's going to be implemented.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, so many as in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded votes requested. Recorded vote will be postponed to a later date. We will now consider log number 4016 by Mr. Alford. For what purpose?
Ms. Mace.
I thought Ms. Mace is.
No, she's here.
Oh, she's back now? Okay, I'm sorry. I was told that you had to leave the hearing for a few minutes.
4576.
We will now consider the amendment by Ms. Mace, log number